Welcome back. Right here for you, I have a simple Express server that shows how server-side rendering React would work. Let's go one by one to figure out what is happening. And by the way, if you're not too familiar using Node and Express, I recommend you check out my other course. Otherwise, assuming that we're comfortable with this, it's fairly easy. All we're doing is importing the Express library to create our server. So we just do Express to create our app server. And within here on line 10, I say app.use express.static, and I don't need that plus sign, to public folder. Now, what does that mean? This is saying that I want to serve static files, such as images, CSS files, and JavaScript files, using the Express built-in static middleware. So if you ever work with Express, this is just the standard to serve any sort of file that we want to do. So again, if our app has CSS files, then we're going to need to add this to the top of our server. And we are going to use the public folder that I can name this whatever I want, but it's the public folder that we're going to have our static files in. And let's ignore line 12 for now and move on to line 13 over here. We see here that we have a react.createElement. And we actually don't need to do this. As the name suggests, this just says we want to create an element, a React element, from app. So app over here that I'm importing can be our app.js file with our React component, in which case we don't need to do this. Or it could be a file that has some view engine, such as EJS, and we want to convert that HTML-like syntax into a React syntax. Either way, line 13 just simply means we have our RoboFriends app. In our case, we can just have our app.js file like we have on our front end. Now from here, all we do is with Express, we can do the .get to say that at the root directory, so if I do robofriends.com/, I will do a GET request and it's going to return, the server is going to return a response that renders the index. So again, we're returning HTML here. We're going to render an index with the content. And this is where things differ from a client-side rendered app. You see, with RoboFriends, we never really needed to have a server. We just had the client files that get delivered, and we can just place it on somewhere like GitHub Pages that hosts our static files. Now within here, we're using something called render to string. And you see over here that render to string comes from something called React-DOM server. And this is a special package that you use when you're doing server-side rendering with React. As the name suggests, all it does, and it's actually quite simple, all it does is saying, hey, just render the RoboFriends app, just print out the entire look of the RoboFriends app and just convert it into string, because when we talk between the server and the client, we have to send text. We can't just send the actual app because, well, that just won't work. Every time we're sending information over the wire, we have to send text, which is why we use things like json.parse as well. And within here, our RoboFriends app, we're also giving it some props. So this props looks like we're just giving it some data. In our case, just because we're doing server-side rendering, let's send them some robots, some JSON. So that is maybe robots that are very, very common that we want to display to the user without sending an API request or doing a fetch call. Maybe we have it in our public folder and we just write a robots.json file and give it maybe 3 objects of robots. We can pass that down as props to robots.friends. And that's what we're doing here. All we're doing here is using the FS module from Node, which says, hey, just read this file in this encoding format, which is pretty much the standard. I think if you leave this blank, it will be still the same because this is the default. And then we do json.parse, again, because we need to send things through text. We want to make sure that this is parsed and ready so that we can send it over the wires all the way to the client browser. Now, although some of this may be new, it's not too bad, is it? It's just a few lines of code. At the end of the day, though, all we're doing is converting our React application, our app, by just calling render to string to convert it to string so we can send it over the wire to the browser. The idea being that if we render this app on the server, instead of just having that div with ID app on the front end like we usually do with React applications, we can send down HTML that is already filled with all our robot elements so that the web page can display our RoboFriends app right away and make the page load seem a lot faster. And we're also sending down some robots initially so that, again, to the user, it appears a lot faster. Now, here's the trick with server-side rendering in React. You see, we need React on both the server and the browser because initially we're sending down a string version, so React DOM server render to string. That's going to convert our React app into a string, send it over the wire, and it arrives in the browser. But in the browser now, we need to do something called React DOM.hydrate. And don't worry, these are only used for server-side rendering. And you just need to know these two things. If you call React DOM.hydrate, it's pretty much like calling the render method in our components. Except that with this React DOM.hydrate, when we call this on a node that already has this server rendered markup that we've created, React is going to preserve the markup, and only attach event handlers so that we can actually interact with our website. We still need to run this because if we just send whatever we get from the server, it's still not interactive. It's just text that we receive. And I know this seems really specific to React, but the principles and the ideas apply to all libraries and frameworks, including Angular, including Vue. Anything that works with single page applications, use something like this. You would render your page or the view on the server, you send it down as text, and then on the front end, you would attach event listeners or any JavaScript functionality that you need. Again, once it is rendered over here, JavaScript takes over by doing something called hydrating, which gives the interactivity of the page that we want. Now, you might be thinking, wait, could I potentially then make web pages work without JavaScript? Maybe they don't have as much interactivity, so we don't even need JavaScript. And yes, one thing you can do with server-side rendering is make web pages that work even without JavaScript. And also, I wanted to point out in the new version of the React DOM server, there is something called render to node stream, which is very, very similar to render to string, except for the fact that we're using something called node stream, which makes this process a lot faster. So it's a bit of a performance improvement. But let's go back to our code. In React, with server-side rendering and client-side rendering, you see that we need React because we need to build that DOM. The only difference is that instead of sending that HTML page with just one div that has ID of an app that React would attach to on the client side, on the server-side rendering, we can actually do that all over here, run render to string, so that instead of the browser doing the work of mounting all those React components, the server has already done this for us. And that's it. those are the main principles of server-side rendering. It sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. We're just changing a few steps. Now, using server-side rendering with React does have some edge cases, and it is quite difficult because React was originally built for single-page applications. So there's a lot of maneuvering that you have to do and a lot of errors that people get when working with server-side rendering. And in an upcoming video, we're going to talk about better alternatives to doing this. But for now, I think in the next video, we should talk about the pros and cons of doing something like this. Because again, remember, although I used React as an example here, the principles are all the same for all types of applications. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.